So Enzo Fernández is a Chelsea player, it's confirmed, and Chelsea have paid a hell of a lot of money for him. The question is he worth it? Well, I've put together here an in-depth analysis of the midfielder's strengths and weaknesses, and importantly, how to build a team around him. So if you want to know whether this was a good investment from Chelsea, stick around until the end, and we'll find out. I want to start by looking at Enzo's role for Benfica. One, because I think it really suits him, and two, because it's nice to put what he's doing into context. So it's a 4-2-3-1 in which Enzo is playing on the left of this double pivot, next to the also promising Florentino Luis. And these two complement each other incredibly well, something I'll touch on a little bit later. But like most double pivots, these players will be getting on the ball a lot in the first phase, so in build-up. Particularly Enzo, who really loves to be at the heart of things when his team is building up. He's a natural at finding space in order to progress, whether that's dropping into the back line or finding a pocket between the lines, and he does this very intuitively. From here, what sets him apart from many other midfielders is his emphasis on progression. He's not just getting on the ball for the sake of it, but to move it into more dangerous areas of the pitch. His passing range is typically very good, and you'll see a lot of these balls into runners, with Enzo orchestrating the shift from build-up into immediate final third threat. Like any good midfielder, he's scanning a lot, often 2 or 3 times before he receives the ball, and that allows him not just to play forward, but to do so quickly. For that reason, he only needs 1 or 2 touches to receive and progress. He's very economical with his ball use, and that allows his team to keep a very high tempo in possession. And that's particularly notable in what I'd call his signature move, which is this immediate switch of play. You'll see Enzo do this all the time, receiving, turning, and switching. Obviously very useful at bypassing pressure. You exit these congested situations and open up the pitch, and it's a really important way of disrupting the opposition's shape. By the way, this is a good reason to play Enzo on the left side of midfield rather than the right, so he can open up onto his right foot and make the most of these passes. It's no surprise then, based on these initial traits, that we're really talking about an orchestrator here, someone who can keep things ticking and then turn that deeper possession into greater threat through inventive progressive passes. And this becomes even clearer when we look at the rest of his attributes. He's happy to receive the ball under pressure, he's comfortable on the turn, he can find ways out of tight situations, and while he's not at the top level of like a Verratti or a Bernardo Silva in terms of press resistance, he's reliable enough to be at the heart of your build-up, maybe outside of those super high press scenarios. And to be honest, he'll tend to avoid them anyway. He much prefers to find those pockets of space to receive and progress. So you see here how he takes a couple of steps to separate himself from his opponent. One thing that will be important in his development at the top level is his passing consistency, and right now his numbers look incredibly good. Although I'm not the biggest fan of pass completion percentage, there's no denying that over all distances, Enzo is operating amongst elite company. And that's pretty impressive considering the frequency and ambition of those passes. There are a couple of errors he needs to cut out of his game. He can dwell on it for a bit too long. Sometimes he loses concentration with those passes, but as a whole package, and at only 21 remember, he has the potential to be a premier deep-lying playmaker. And part of that is because he remains useful and effective as we move up the pitch. Now, it's important to consider that for club and country, Enzo isn't given significant responsibility in the final third. Both Argentina and especially Benfica have loads of attacking players ahead of Enzo. Typically, you've got João Mario and Rafa Silva between the lines, you've got a winger on one side and a very attacking fullback on the other, plus your centre forward, which is more than enough firepower. But that doesn't mean Enzo is outcast from the final third, quite the opposite. In this system, which by the way is a very fluid one, he's got the freedom to wander forward and lurk around or sometimes inside the box, and we've seen evidence of good creative ability. In his River Plate days, where he was playing as more of an 8, he showed some great imagination and real decisiveness in the final third, and doing this consistently would definitely take him to a different level. This assist for Argentina I really like, with the carry and the little dinked ball. His in-swinging crosses are really dangerous, and even if he's not directly threatening, you kind of want him around the box anyway, just to recycle and keep the pressure on. His shooting is admittedly quite inconsistent. He takes a few too many long shots, resulting in just an 11% shot accuracy this season. But his ball striking technique isn't terrible, and in better positions he can be a goal threat. Domestically, he's got 1 goal in 17 games from 2.1 expected goals, so underperforming XG slightly, but 3.7 expected assists, 5 actual assists. He ranked really highly for midfielders in terms of chance creation, and from some of these clips it should be clear why. He obviously needs a degree of freedom to do this, breaking out from that double pivot and getting closer to the box, and that's something to consider when figuring out the best role for Enzo. But for now, let's move on to the defensive side of his game. Enzo Fernández is a really interesting player defensively. Both Argentina and Benfica have very disciplined structures off the ball, whether that's 4-3-3 like here, or 4-4-2. And in either case, Enzo is going to be at the heart of the midfield, where you get the most out of his defensive profile. First things first, he's very aggressive. He's an Argentinian midfielder, so that's a given. But to complement that, he covers ground really well and is a very strong tackler, although he's not a consistent tackler. That's not necessarily a problem in these defensive systems, where he's typically covering zones rather than marking man-to-man, only pressuring when necessary and then being very decisive in stamping out danger. In that sense, tactically and positionally, he's great. And in a compact midfield like this, where there's plenty of cover, his aggression and pressuring are super useful, a big part of why Argentina and Benfica are really hard to beat. However, the more I watched of Enzo, the more I realised that he isn't as reliable when he gets isolated defensively. So I saw quite a few situations where he was overcommitting in tackles, and this is especially an issue when pressing or counter-pressing. His judgment can be a bit off in his approach. He doesn't slow himself down enough or gets the angle wrong and gets beaten. There's a tendency for him to lose his bearings a bit and not cover the right space. Now, I know these clips are against very good players, but I do think a specialist 6, Fabinho or a Casemiro, do better in these situations. He also doesn't have the aerial ability, so all in all, as a lone 6, where you are going to get isolated at times, I'm not sure he's the ideal candidate. But that leads us pretty perfectly onto this last section, where I want to discuss the kind of environment that Enzo would thrive in, and how to get the best out of him. I think at the elite level of football, we're sort of in an era of very specialised roles. That's got a lot to do with positional play and how those positional teams are structured. But it's important to note that the environments Enzo has so far thrived in have not been rigid positional systems. Like I said before, Benfica are very fluid, Argentina are pretty fluid as well, and that suits this kind of player who's not doing one thing exceedingly well, he's doing a lot of things very well. So he wants to sometimes be really deep, others he's going to be between the lines, he wants to be lurking on the edge of the box, or crossing from a wide position, and for Benfica especially, this is all very possible. His relationship with Florentino Luis is really important because they really do work in tandem. If one is dropping into the back line, the other is the progressive option in midfield. In all of those clips where Enzo is around the box, you'll notice Florentino isn't there because he's covering defensively. So to get the most out of Enzo, you really have to build around him. Sort of in the way that Erik ten Hag did with Frenkie de Jong. A very different player in terms of how they use the ball, but I suppose similar in their situations. Frenkie had the freedom to contribute in a lot of ways at Ajax, then went to a more rigid positional system at Barcelona, and it took him a while to get going. There are definitely other factors, but until recently, the zones at Barcelona really didn't suit him. Positionally, you were either a 6 or an 8, but rarely both, and you wouldn't want Enzo in that kind of setup. I don't think it'll be too much of a concern under Graham Potter, who is a pretty adaptable manager. The bigger issue is making sure you also have the players to complement him. Specifically, I would say you probably want a dedicated defensive midfielder to rotate with him and offer cover when he pushes forward. He obviously can play as a lone 6, he did in the World Cup, with the right cover, but I do think that you're missing out on a big chunk of his skill set if you do that. If he is playing on the left-hand side, then you also need to find a balance that works with the fullback and the winger. So with all the crazy signings that Chelsea are making, it is a bit hard to predict what their best 11 will be. But I would just warn them, and I'd warn Chelsea fans, that achieving balance, especially without an obvious defensive pivot in the squad, might be tricky. Regardless, the potential in Enzo Fernández is admittedly extremely high. While I'm not sure if he has the natural ability to be generational, whatever that means, he could be a very reliable component in a top side. The reason being is that he gives you the best of both worlds really. In a top possession team, he gives you the ability to move the ball quickly around the pitch, but you still retain a very disciplined, very decent disruptor when you don't have the ball. Often teams will have to choose one or the other, but with Enzo you get both. On top of that, we know for a fact that he has the mentality to play at the highest level. He was immense in the World Cup final. The tricky part is actually composing a team around him, and that's where things get a lot more interesting. Let me know in the comments how you would build around Enzo. Do Chelsea have the right components to get the best out of him? I'd love to hear what you guys think. And with that, I'll sign off for now. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to leave a like if you did, subscribe for more, and I'll see you soon. Take it easy.